I am delighted to be part of this opening plenary, and I want to begin by making a totally objective, unbiased, personal statement. I think my husband has invented an extraordinary initiative that gives people everywhere a chance to engage in partnerships of purpose, to solve problems, and to seize opportunities faster, better, and at lower cost. And I can say this because I had nothing to do with creating CGI. And I want to thank him for 10 years and so much that we have to celebrate and build on because of the work that started back in 2005. We're now up to more than 3,100 commitments to action that is valued at nearly $100 billion. And when you think about it, that's an extraordinary statement, but what stands behind it are so many stories and increasingly so much data about what works. More than 430 million lives improved in more than 180 countries, including more than 44 million children who now have access to a better education because of all of you. More than 27 million people have increased access to safe drinking water and sanitation. This is a great record, and it's one to be grateful for, but it couldn't happen without the individual commitments and the hard work of the CGI staff and the Clinton Foundation and each and every one of our partners and commitment makers. Now, we called this session Reimagining Impact, because the last thing we want to do is just get into a rut where we do the same things over and over again. Bill and Chelsea particularly are driving us to watch the trend lines as well as the headlines. So even as you will see videos for each of our 10 years with a particular commitment that really represents all of the commitments in the course of the next 3 days, and we mark these accomplishments of this first decade, we have been asking ourselves, how can we continue to reinvent philanthropy and business as effectively in the next 10 years as we have done in the past? To help us think about the future, we've invited two far-sighted leaders who are busy remaking iconic institutions into more nimble and innovative forces for change in the global economy. Dr. Yong Kim is the first medical doctor to serve as president of the World Bank. He brought to that job on-the-ground experience with public health and the human impact of global development work, and not surprisingly, he has set about transforming the bank and its crucial work to better reflect the complexities of a 21st century interdependent world. He's breaking down silos, which, as you know, exist in every institution despite our best efforts, focusing on cross-cutting challenges, thinking globally, increasing transparency, accountability, and bang for the buck. Under his leadership, the World Bank is doing more than ever to empower women and girls and promote inclusive prosperity around the world. And I think Dr. Kim would be the first to say that work is just beginning. There is more change on the way. Now, like Dr. Kim, Ginni Rometty, the 9th CEO in the history of IBM and the first woman to lead Big Blue, has steered a whirlwind of innovation since becoming CEO in 2012. She is aggressively leading IBM into new territory: cloud computing, big data, cognitive computing, partnerships across sectors, even an alliance with Apple. Last year, she opened a new IBM research center in Nairobi, the first anywhere in Africa. And Ginni recently offered 3 rules that can help guide leaders and institutions intent on constant reinvention. Number 1, don't protect the past. Number 2, never be defined by your product. And number 3, always transform yourself. Now, I think that's a pretty good place to start for this first plenary in Reimagining Impact. So please join us in welcoming Jim Young Kim, and Ginni Rometty. Well, this is very exciting for me because these are two people whom I admire greatly. I've known and worked with Jim for many years and am so grateful for our partnership going back to the 1990s on a lot of difficult issues when he was with Partners in Health, having co-founded it with Dr. Paul Farmer. And I have admired Ginni from afar, not too far because IBM's CEO headquarters are in Armonk, New York, not far from where Bill and I live. So it's a real pleasure for me to have both of you here. And I want to start by asking you, in the idea of reimagining impact, both of you have taken big legacy institutions, and you have tried to lead them in some ways in a different process, but also with different missions and goals that you have set. How do you keep going? What is the hard work of reimagining an institution for impact in the 21st century? And what advice or lessons would you have to share with all the institutions represented here, governments, corporations, labor unions, NGOs, philanthropies, et cetera? Ginni, you want to start?
Okay. Well, boy, I would say when you say we both transforming, right? Because never stops. And I'd also say when you're 100 years old in 170 countries, you have a little bit of perspective, sometimes patterns, and you see both progress, and I think you also see promises of breakthroughs. And I think it's about a focus on both of those things. And so I know part of why I too wanted to join you and admire what you've done here. I think this idea about making progress every day is one thing you have to do, and then there is always this promise of a breakthrough. And I think it applies to many of the initiatives that are underway, because I think about this idea of staying to progress every day, and you might find it interesting. We had launched something called the Corporate Services Corps. It is modeled after the Peace Corps. And at this point in time, it's now done 1,000 projects with 3,000 IBMers from across the world in 60 countries. And they could range from, helping deter cervical cancer in Peru to HIV transmission in Ghana to the environment. And it's this staying on it every day. You can see progress on really difficult issues, but you can see it every day. And in that case, at the same time, you develop leaders who I think are global citizens. So on one hand, my view is it's progress every day, and on the second is a very clear view about the future. And if I might draw the sort of between business and this whole session, I think that there is this promise of a breakthrough that will impact many of the initiatives that will be talked about, and many of them that are under the Clinton Global Initiative. And if I might just sort of share what I think is a breakthrough, and it will reimagine, with your theme, it'll reimagine industries, professions, and it is this topic of big data. I mean, there is many transformative technology trends right now. And that in and of itself is another discussion. They're all at one time, so change is faster. But this one in particular, I believe it's a natural resource. It'll be the world's next natural resource. But like anything, it's only if you do something with it. And President Clinton mentioned, he'd share some data about what we've learned earlier on. And this topic, if you think of it as a natural resource, you can predict things. And I think many of the problems that we are all working on that bring us together are problems that are solvable, but people walk by them. And that with this kind of ability to predict, I think of a saying that is, once you know something, it's hard to unknow it, and you'll be compelled to act. And my advice on this, just that it will transform everything, and I think of it on many of things such as that we've done. actually, President Kim and I were talking about Ebola before we walked out. And I said we'd recently done some work in Sierra Leone, which is about analyzing social sentiment in a topic and a problem that people think is difficult. You can use that data to tell where the hotspots of fear and education are, and then direct few resources right of way to these things. Or if you're in Rio de Janeiro, you can use that kind of information. You can predict weather 24, 48 hours in advance. So when there's a mudslide in the favelas, you can do something about it. And it does, because you know, it forces a government to pull departments together, break silos, and do it. So I circle back to, I mean, my optimism and both my advice, it is about the progress every day, but it is then about seizing these breakthroughs and not ignoring them. And I think this one about data as a natural resource is going to allow us to predict, and it is going to be the promise that lets us, once we know, not unknow, and actually do something about many of these problems.
I like that. That's a very good line. Once you know, can't unknow. Jim, how do you see reimagining impact at the bank?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and I have to say, what Ginni just said about big data. You know, Watson won Jeopardy, and we're now seeing if Watson can get through the World Bank database, right? So we hope that Watson doesn't give up and quit. We have so much data going back to onion skins in caves in Pennsylvania. But I think I agree that that's the key. But what we did, and it gets right to why I think the Clinton Global Initiative has been successful. People came here and they made very specific commitments, and then it was time limited. And so if you talk to anybody in the private sector, you've got to have a very clear goal with a very clear end date. In the public sector, we have a tough time doing that. And so I was involved in an HIV treatment goal, and even though we didn't reach the goal at the World Health Organization, it transformed what we did, because we had to start with that goal and then go backwards and ask ourselves, okay, what do we need to do to get there, and are we fit for purpose to get there? So we have two goals: ending poverty, but instead of just saying the poverty should end sometime, we said by 2030. And then the other thing we said is we think that every country in the world wants to move towards shared prosperity. You use that term a lot, Secretary Clinton. Is exactly, you know, everyone now understands that we've got to deal with the problem of rising inequality, especially in some places. It's not rising everywhere. So if you have those two goals, then you have to ask, are we fit for purpose to actually accomplish those two goals? And then we did a survey of the entire organization, and they said, we're not fit for purpose, and these are the things that bother us most. So I took it seriously, and I said, okay, we're going to change all that. A lot of people on the staff said, wait a minute, we didn't actually mean for you to actually change it. We just wanted to tell you that this is what's wrong with the organization. Now, the good news is we're almost done with it, but it's hard, because these huge bureaucracies are, you know, imbued with politics. But I think now that we have made the change, for example, what we've now asked our teams, we now have a team on transport, we have a team on health and education. What we've asked is, what are the most transformative solutions out there? President Clinton, when he was president, said, the good news about the American educational system is for every problem we have, somebody somewhere out there has solved it. So taking that seriously, I've told my team, okay, you find all those somebodies out there who've solved these problems, and then we're going to bring them together. We're going to curate this knowledge. We have to work on the knowledge. It's not just raw, and we're going to give that knowledge to every country in its full form. Not what to do, but how these people who really made it happen, how they did it. And so we call this the science of delivery. And if we can be successful in bringing that knowledge, the money that we can provide will be important, but that kind of specific knowledge, you should go through structural reforms. Here's how 15 countries have tackled this particular problem of removing fuel subsidies while protecting the poor. We don't know which one of these is going to work for you, but we're going to give it to you in full detail so you have better things to think with. I think people are getting excited about it now. At least I hope they are.
Well, I think both of you, yes, indeed, have very well described reimagining impact with what you're each doing in your own institutions. And the idea that big data, information, can be useful seems so obvious. I mean, really, who's against information? But it turns out a lot of people are. because they don't want information that violates their ideology or some other pre-existing belief or conviction that they have held. Could you talk a little bit, Ginni, about what's the process? And since you run such a large global company, what's the process for trying to instill within your employees and others with whom you interact that sense of optimism that you have, that, you know what, this can be done, we can do it together? And then Jim, I'd like to hear from you on the same, because I started giving speeches when I was a senator from New York, decrying what I called an evidence-free zone in American politics. There's a lot of evidence, but if people don't want to hear it, see it, work with it, then what good does it do? So the more data we get, how do we package it and present it so that people will gravitate toward it?
Yeah, there's a few questions buried in there, and there is no doubt. Many people will say, I'm drowning in information, actually. You hear that saying all the time. And what is different about this moment in time is you do have to make it digestible, actionable, at that minute. And that has been, at other times, it's been a cost issue, it's been a how it's presented to you issue, it's been that it's been given to you at the wrong time, not at the moment you need it. So there are many of those things that can be tackled now. But in the end, I always say to my own teams, this is about a culture of analytics. It is about a changing, that decisions should not always be about a gut. You go from gut decisions to fact decisions, and that there are sayings about that, right? That the highest paid opinion matters, not necessarily the fact-based opinion. And so it is a change of culture in what can be done. But I think we're entering an era, and you say, how do you give people hope about these things and about changing? I think it's back to the broader change agenda. And while we are both changing big institutions, and we were talking outside with some of the other presidents of countries here, there is no two ways. Change, I always say growth and comfort never coexist. It's true for a country, a person, and a company. And so I think how you do that with people is you both paint reality and then you give them hope about where this is going. I think that data is essential not only on the facts of today, but on the hope about where this is going. And this idea, and again, your theme, reimagine, I think is really critical, because this is about reimagining a world that really can be different than the one before it with this. But I also, I circle back where I started. It is not about data running your life. This is about being informed and making better judgments and better decisions and allowing a way to deal with this overdose, right? Maybe we'll talk about healthcare, but the average doctor, medical information's doubling in 5 years. My friend Toby Cosgrove, you're probably the other expert on this. He says it'll double every 18 months soon. That's impossible to think. And then go jump now into a continent like Africa, 54 countries. How could a doctor, even if there was one doctor, or 10,000 caregivers to one doctor, how could they ever deal with that without our ability? And to me, there is hope on how to deal with that, but it's got to be both presented differently, and then it's a culture then of how to use that to make decisions.
Jim?
So first of all, I think some of the efforts you led toward open government, Secretary Clinton, is having a huge impact. It's hard to get your head around it at first, to just put the data out there. But one of the things we were talking about in the back, Ginni and I, were that if you make data available and if you add to the mix smartphones, you can do things like go to a school and you'll know from a website that a teacher has been paid to go there. And then you can take a picture with your smartphone of an empty school, and then you can upload it to the web, and then all of a sudden you have a mechanism for accountability that we just didn't have before. And so this is, I think, where we're going to have to move with big data. We have to make big data usable by everybody, especially the poorest. And that could be truly revolutionary for them. But let me get back to the juxtaposition between evidence and optimism. So I think there's a real place for evidence-based optimism. And for people like me who work with poor people, you have to also understand that optimism in many ways is a moral choice. Because if you walk in to a place like Liberia, for example, into the jungle, and you say to yourself, there's no way that we can ever provide community-based treatment and prevention of Ebola in a place like this because you've never done it before, then frankly, we're going to be in big trouble. But my longtime colleague Paul Farmer just got back from Liberia last night, and we were talking, And because through CHAI, I mean, you know what we've done in Rwanda. We've taken extremely poor remote areas and actually built academic medical centers. So we know it's possible. So the first thing I think that all of us who work with poor people have to understand is that if we come in cynical and pessimistic, poor people are in big trouble. We have to force ourselves to get to a place where we're going to search the earth for all the evidence that might be available that suggests we can do something about this. And so what we did in bringing Paul Farmer and others in who've done really complicated things is we now have a vision for how to go forward to not only build these hospitals, which are critical, and it's just great that the US government is stepping up. We're not going to end this epidemic unless we get treatment and prevention out into the rural areas. And the good news is that we have people who've done it before. And so, one, optimism is a moral choice, but two, you have to hold yourself to find the evidence for how to do it effectively. If you bring those two together and you can move forward with an evidence-based optimism, even in the poorest settings, everyone has a chance. And let me just give you why I feel so strongly about this. I was born in 1959 in Korea, in a country that was poorer than Ghana at the time, GDP per capita. And World Bank economists and also many development economists said, Korea, south of the 38th parallel, is a basket case. They're too poor, they're too rural, all the mineral wealth is in North Korea, all the industrial bases in North Korea, they have too few people who've had college education. There is no chance that Korea, south of the 38th parallel, will ever develop. It's the Philippines that has the best chance. And so, year after year, decade after decade, the Koreans have fought so hard to reinvent themselves, and they're doing it again. You know, President Park, they probably have one of the most highly effective educational systems in the world. They have asked me and the World Bank to do a complete study of their educational system because now they want to be more creative. So I think that one of the things we have to say, especially those of us, and many here who work in the poorest countries, that we have to just take an oath that we will never call any country, any village, any group of people a basket case, and look to find ways that have happened in other places that we can transform every community in the world.
Thank you both. Well, I think evidence-based optimism and comfort versus growth are two big takeaways, at least from my perspective. I wanted to just ask Ginni if she had any points to add on Ebola, because I know IBM is doing some very exciting work in trying to work with governments and international organizations to map health systems and to try to predict where additional resources would be needed. We're going to have a very important session on Ebola tomorrow with a lot of the major players, but I think it's important to hear from you, Ginni, because of what IBM is trying to do.
Well, I think, like many companies, actually, I think there is a role that many of us can play, and it really falls under this broader public-private partnership kind of banner. But as often, and as President Kim said a minute ago, many times there are known solutions to things. And as well, it is about the communication and the information and the coordination to make available. So when it comes to Ebola, there are several things we are doing. And one of them is around providing the mechanism, happens to be, doesn't matter, the technology, a cloud, that lets all the different non-for-profits and other agencies all coordinate efforts. Because that is a big issue just in of itself. There are many people well-intended and organizations well-intended. So we can help organize that. And then the second is, I just reiterate this point about being able to sense where issues are, where fear is the greatest, education is the most lacking. It takes something that's otherwise not solvable, and then you target with our limited resources to get out to those places to educate. And so we're working with partners, other companies in Africa, certainly the mobility carriers that are out there, Bharti Airtel, the like of that, to go in and try to pinpoint where different public safety and others can go. So between both ends of that spectrum, both coordinating it, but then doing something very much on the ground that affects individuals. And I know our efforts are like many other companies, I think in the same sort of vein, but it is both a public-private partnership.
Absolutely, and that's really the heartbeat of CGI. Jim, I wanted to ask you about today, the World Bank Group, the IFC, and several private sector partners are launching a new commitment to action called She Works, which is aimed to realize gender parity in the workplace. I know you've made a big point of prioritizing gender equality at the bank, which is music to my heart, but why, based on all this talk about evidence, why has the bank and you personally decided that this is not just a nice thing to do, but this is absolutely crucial to everything else you want to accomplish?
Well, so many countries are now realizing that in order to really grow, to get their economies to grow, they need to bring more women into the workforce. And you'll remember at Davos, Prime Minister Abe quoted you, Secretary Clinton, as having told him that he could gain so many points on his GDP growth if he included women. So now Womenomics is underway, and he's very serious about doing it. So what we thought was to bring some companies, and I just brought my paper out so I could get it at Care.com, Coca-Cola, Ernst & Young, Gap, and Intel, but also emerging market companies, Belcor, Kuwait Energy, Odebrecht, Uradu, and Zuleka Hospitals. And so the idea is to improve both the quality and the quantity of women's employment. So this is everything from just actually counting, how much of your workforce is women, to things like leadership and mentoring, and also, very clear approach to sexual harassment. That if you take very systematic measures to improve the quality of life for the women who work, and then also to recruit more, that we think they can make a lot of gains. And so over the next 2 years, we hope to make a lot of progress. And it's the other end of the stream. So now most economies anyway that are far behind in terms of women's participation are asking us for help in how to increase women's participation. This is sort of coming from the private sector angle to make it actually easier and more desirable for women to work in these companies.
And Ginni, of course, as the first woman leader of such a major, I think it's now the largest technology and consulting company in the world, how do we get more women into the so-called STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics? And are there any lessons from your own experience over the course of your work life that you'd like to share with us?
Well, first, just a couple. One is that this is a topic I think it's critical, and it's critical for some of what I think are the very obvious reasons, but it's also because the talent that is required in small businesses, medium, large, you must find a way to embrace 50% of the population into this. This is why it's so obvious. It's good for business, it's good for a country, it's good for an economy, and I come from a company that's had a strong view about this for many years. I often remind myself, IBM had a position and a policy on equal opportunity. It was 11 years before the Civil Rights Amendment. And it was, very strong and practiced even in states of segregation at that time. So this is deep roots about this. I would share one of my learnings that I think is important for this to really work around the world, and that I would define diversity differently now. I mean, I think in some bare minimum, it's about representation, but that is really bare minimum. That does not have anything to do with contribution. And then often people speak about inclusion, which talks about maybe being part of something or a seat at a table. That is not enough, and that won't drive economic growth. It is really about the word engagement, and that it applies to women as it does to other diversity groups that are there, and that there are ways, all of us that run organizations, businesses, countries, to drive that engagement. And engagement means you are comfortable in any way to contribute, but you do contribute. You don't just sit there, you're not just part of. And I would challenge that, the social technologies that are out there, they are a great leveler for this. I see it every day when projects are done. When you handle them in traditional ways, meetings, people speak, represent, a certain group of people always speak. You then give them freedom in a community and in a networking, in a social networking way, and you will watch another group of people contribute in entirely different ways. And to me, that is your way to unlock and expose an entire segment of the world population beyond just women. So that has been my learning, that this is not representation, inclusion, this is engagement. And you've got to drive to have engagement anywhere in the world. And I would jump over to something, that we've done together at the World Bank, because many women are about small, medium businesses as well. That way to hit, and that's when you talk about she.com and is the same thing. And we've done something called Supplier Connect, which because for small, medium businesses to engage with big businesses, it's difficult. I always say when someone wants to sell us something, they could knock on 1,000 doors. And if you're a small company, you can't do that. So this idea of Supplier Connect that we did with the World Bank, and today there's, I believe it's 5 million small, medium enterprises, 20 languages in 30 countries already now running. And it's a way for bigger businesses to say, here's my needs, and for smaller entrepreneurial businesses to have to only sort of apply once to fill them. And so I think as well, in addition to engagement, you then have to provide access for this to happen. Those two words, engagement and access. And that's just, I was thinking of Dr., and it's one of the things we've done together around that.
Do you want to add something, Jim?
Yeah, it's a great, in 2002 we started, and we were trying to help small and medium enterprises, especially in developing countries, with just the basic knowledge that they need to do to enter the market. And we were doing it on a small scale. I think it was 2007 we started working with IBM, and they were just able to help us take it to another level. So, we focused a lot on small and medium enterprises and making sure that we do everything we can to provide them access to markets. And when we partnered with IBM, it really was great because the scale was just amazing. Yeah.
Well, I am distressed to say that our time has run out, and I won't be able to keep asking questions of these two remarkable leaders to really educate and edify all of us. But I just want to draw from what they said, and particularly because of the title of this CGI week. Reimagining impact requires leaders who will reimagine and who will be unafraid to do so and ask themselves, beginning with themselves, hard questions, and then ask others in their leadership team, but even get beyond, because I think what Ginni said about engage and access, those are two key points. And too often, we don't go the extra steps to make sure that people feel welcome and encouraged to engage, and then have access to follow up with real engagement. And we will have Prime Minister Abe here, I think tomorrow, and he will talk about why he is following this strategy. And I would just throw out there to all of the governments represented, all of the businesses represented, as Ginni said and as Jim has really validated, we cannot grow the global economy if we do not open the doors to women to participate in the economy. And it's been quite exciting to see a lot of the changes that are going on, but it's also been somewhat distressing to see how hard change still is, including in my own country. We had a survey about poverty in the United States and looking at incomes in the United States that came out last week, and one of the big news items was that women's income compared to men's income had gone up 1 penny. We now are 78 cents on the dollar. So when I talk about this, I'm not just talking about somebody else in some other region of the world. I'm also talking about developed countries, that we have to keep knocking down those external and internal obstacles that are cultural and religious and based in views of women's roles and their capacities that are just no longer affordable. They're wrong, but they're also no longer affordable. So please join me in thanking our two excellent participants. Thank you both very much.